I'm delighted to be joined today by Raymond and Harold Gold of South Fallsburg, New York. My name is Marvin Rappaport. I'm joined by my colleagues Myron, Gittel, and Alan Barrish. We are all residents and in some cases grew up here in Sullivan County, New York. The purpose of the conversation is to record oral histories of those who lived, worked, and grew up in the area of the Catskills that has commonly been called the Borscht Belt. It's a resort area, largely Jewish hotels and bungalow colonies, which had its own culture over a period of time. And through the assistance of a project called StoryCorps, we're recording oral histories of individuals whose stories will make up the fabric of our community. So let me start, if I may, with Harold. And Raymond, at any point, you both can answer. How did your family come to live in the Catskills in this region?
Well, I think the first one of all our family was my Aunt Lena. That's my mother's older sister. And she worked here, worked as a chambermaid in hotels early on, she probably came around 1908.
From New York City?
From New York City.
Mm-hmm.
And that she wasn't born in New York, but she was here with her father, and they were poor.
Mm-hmm.
So anything they could make was good. Then she got married while she was here. She got married while she was here. She married Willie Mankus, and he was a plumber, and she lived in a little place past which was eventually became our building, which was our high school and elementary school as well. And that's, you have anything?
Well, he also had besides being a plumber, he was basically almost like a jack of all trades. And he also had a tire vulcanizing business on Main Street in South Fallsburg when tires had to be repaired rather than purchased new. And well, that was their early beginnings.
How about your parents? How did they?
And as I recall, my father came to the Lower East Side as an immigrant when he was 16 years old from Lithuania. And he worked, whatever jobs he can get. One of his earliest jobs, luckily, was to work for a plumber in Brooklyn, New York, who was an Irishman, who was very, very kind to him and patient with him with the fact that he couldn't speak English at all. And from that, someone gave him he was sponsored by an uncle who worked in the garment industry by the name of Rimmer. And from that beginning, he entered an ad in a newspaper where he was able to come up to South Fallsburg, where he was able to get like $3 a week plus room and board, which was a big step upward for him.
And roughly what year?
I believe that was around 1914.
I said before, but 13, 14.
13,
I think.
14.
And your mom?
My mom lived on the Lower East Side with her mother, and she used to sell newspapers. And my Aunt Lena, who my father was working for, liked my father, and got him together with my mother, and that's how he met my mother.
And what year were each of you born?
I was born in 1923.
And are you the oldest in the family?
No, my brother Morris was the older. He was born in 1920.
20.
And I was born in 1929.
29. And there were other siblings?
No.
In between, so just the three brothers?
Yes.
Okay. And you mentioned your dad was in the plumbing business.
Well, with this person he worked for was a very dynamic guy, and apparently he really didn't take care of his plumbing business that well. And as I recall, he moved to Florida after he had a divorce with my aunt. Is that right?
Yeah, but that was 1925.
Oh, that was
we're
later on.
talking,
But anyway, uh, soon after my father moved in to Sullivan County, and he started doing his own plumbing work. He had to go to the Army in the First World War, where he served there for 2 years, and he was wounded twice, and he had to stay in France several months after the war ended to deal with his wounds.
And what was the resort nature of the area at that time, if you know? Unlike what it was in the 50s
As I know, it was,
and so forth.
as I heard,
Yes.
it was basically small little farms who would rent out some rooms to the either sick people who came here for fresh air from the Lower East Side, or some of the immigrants who wanted to get out of the Lower East Side for a week or 10 days to enjoy the fresh air and milk and good vegetables that we
Primarily Jewish immigrants.
Yes.
Yes, well, my father's first big chance came in 1921. The Flagler Hotel, owned by Fleischer and Morgenstern. Morgenstern was a real midget, and Fleischer was the outside man. And my father would, when I was a little kid, I'd ride around with my father. I was his helper. I was 4 or 5 years old. You can imagine how much I helped. But I used to go with him all the time. But in 1921, the Flagler Hotel was remodeling their main building. And I should tell you a story about my father. We were taught integrity and honesty, both my father and my mother. But my father, of course, was in business, but my mother took care of the books and so forth. And my father, when he went overseas, he owed Solter and Weinzer, there was a big plumbing supply in New York City. They were probably the biggest at that time. He owed them $35. Didn't have the money to pay them. So when from France, before he went to the front, he was in the 78th Division. He saved up, and they got $30 a month infantry pay, but if you were going into action, you got a 10% increase, so you get $33. Anyway, he saved up $25 from France, so in case he got killed, and he sent a money order to the Soldier and Weinzer, so in case he got killed, he had paid up his debts, and we were taught that, and I think that we pretty well emulated my father. But anyway, he went down to see them. The Flagler Hotel wanted to give him the job, but he didn't have money to buy material. It was a big job. And he said, well, where could he get money? So he went down to New York to see Soldier and Weinzer, to see maybe they can figure out some way that he always paid them, maybe he could get some material, because they weren't going to pay him in advance, and he could make money on the job. And they took him into their private quarters. And there on the wall was a framed $35 money order, which a young soldier had sent them from France in 1918, and they showed him on the wall. The $35 money order. They never cashed it. They kept it there. They gave my father $50,000 unsecured credit, so he could do the Flagler job.
What year?
What's that?
What year was this?
This was 1921 or 22.
That was an awful lot of money.
It was a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
They gave him unsecured credit, and they figured any man who would send us $35 from France when he's going up to the front lines. The 78th Division saw a lot of action. As a matter of fact, I have a book on the history of it, where 3,100 men went into action in the Ardennes. 1,800 were either killed or wounded. So you know that they saw action. And that gave my father his start. And of course, from there, all the other hotels were coming along, and he was able to handle it. My mother took care of the bookkeeping part, or they had an accountant, but she did the everyday work.
And when did it change from? And Flagler, you mentioned, as having been in business in the early 1900s. Not many hotels were in those days in business, as Raymond described. Most were farms with tourists and what have you. When did it change over to the point where there were many hotels? Was it the
Well, I would say this is before I was born, but basically from what I heard, it's basically during the 1920s where these farms added more rooms, and then
So, for example,
That-
Grossingers might be in that category,
Yeah.
which was originally a farm and it became a
and
prominent
many of these small hotels that are no longer here, they started off basically as little boarding houses and farms where they kept adding more and more rooms as they were doing more business, and basically, I guess from what I hear, in the 1930s is when they started growing a little more. But then you had the Great Depression, and before that, my father was doing plumbing work for a lot of these hotels, Ambassador Hotel, Elm Shade Hotel, I can mention many others, where as a result of the Depression, they couldn't pay. And that almost bankrupt. My father never went bankrupt, but it left my father with a great deal of debt, all during the 1930s, which he always paid. And is that what you recall, Harold?
Yeah.
Which he always called. So basically, it was a real struggle to live up here financially. I mean, I hardly ever saw my father when I was growing up as a youngster. He was always working. And
not just summer related, although the hotels were only open in the
well,
summer. in those
the
days.
hotels were getting bigger,
Right.
And growing. And of course, then was during then the war came around, and Harold had to go to Harold was in college, then he went to the Army. And my older brother Morris was married about that time with several children, went to work in defense work. And basically I was in high school, and after school where I would help my father work and take care of what was the remnants of the hotels where everything stopped. But people still were coming up to the Catskills, even during the war years, just to get away for a week or so. And
Well, I tell you, part because Raymond was too young. He was 2 years old when I was 8. The big difference. And I remember coming home from school one day and seeing my father and mother in the so-called living room, front room they called it then. And my father was holding another envelope in his hand. My mother, another hotel going under, couldn't pay. And at that time, now this is 1932, 33, my father said he had bad debts of $135,000. Now you can imagine, it's a lot of money today, but it was a lot of money in 1933. And my mother was extremely upset. And I was a little boy. I just sat in the room listening to them talking. And I heard my father say, "Well, don't worry. I came here with nothing. I made it here. We're losing it now. We'll make it again." But my mother was extremely upset, and 2 days later she had a very bad stroke, and they didn't think that she would survive. But she did. But she could write. She couldn't speak, but she could write. And she said that she didn't want to go to the hospital. She wanted to remain in her own room. In those days, Raymond slept in a little bed by himself. He was only 2, and Morris and I slept together. So 3 kids shared a room. But that was in those days. Today you wouldn't. God forbid you should do that today. And so they moved my mother into the bed where Raymond was, and they had a nurse come in and stay in the house who lived in, and she slept in the bedroom where Morris and I were, and we crowded in some more in the rest of the house, and they thought my mother wouldn't survive, and in those days they had the Loomis Sanitarium where they had opened that up
In Liberty.
in Liberty. And a man by the name of Sam Weiner, not the furniture store, another Sam Weiner, you remember him. and he had been gassed during the World War, so he was given a pension, and he had to go there for treatment. Eventually, he died from it. And my father asked him, maybe he could get a doctor from there to come down, and because they had tried, and they said they couldn't leave the grounds. But Mr. Weiner was friendly with one of the doctors, and I remember this, even though I was only 8 years old, but I remember it. And Mr. Weiner and the doctor finally said, okay, he would leave the ground. They weren't supposed to leave the grounds, and he came down, and the first thing he did, he threw out all the medication that they were giving my mother. He said to get her out of bed, and they hold on to her, but she could get movement, and she started to get better. He probably saved her life. And in those days, if you got stroke or that, you stayed in bed. But he got her out of bed, and Mr. Weiner was...
Anyway, also, it was in the 1920s where, in addition to trying to do plumbing work and make a living my father used to hang gutters and wheels. He also got involved in selling propane gas. It was around the late
1928.
1928. And my father would go to New Jersey, I don't remember where, to bring back some of these 100-pound cylinders to resell to potential users. And that's how Fallsburg Gas finally got started to grow into what became the largest propane gas company in Sullivan County at the time, until Harold sold it when we all got older. And basically, Harold basically ran the gas company, and as I got older, I started getting involved with the plumbing part of the business, and which ultimately became from Gold Plumbing and Heating to Gold Mechanical. And I started working with my father, in bungalows and rooming houses, and then finally in some of the largest hotels in the county. And from that, I expanded into becoming what I would say was a major plumbing and heating and air conditioning contractor in the Hudson Valley. Where I did work in West Point and in outlying areas as well as the Catskills.
When you started your respective businesses, what portion of your revenues were derived from the resorts, would you say?
All 90%
Okay.
at the time.
A major part of it.
So if there were issues or the Depression or anything else, it impacted you radically.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
We're leaving out my brother Morris, because he's not here, obviously. But he was the one who really, my father was a little sideline, but then Morris was 19 or so when he got married, and he had to make a living. And he would do okay in the gas company. In those days, it was $8 a tank of gas. So if he sold 5 tanks a day, he'd turn in the money for 4 tanks, and one tank he put in his pocket. So he managed to get by okay. And but my father paid the bills out of a plumbing business, so the gas company had money.
Well, I mean, it's not like Morris was stealing. Basically, what Morris was a flamboyant type of person, and he picked up a lot of his business by socializing and entertaining. I mean, he'd go to a restaurant or a hotel bar, and he'd pick up the check for people and treat people. But it was good publicity for us to grow as well. I mean, he got to know a lot of people throughout the county, and when business was there, I think we had a good shot at being considered.
Things changed after the war, and pretty
World
much
War I.
World War II. No, we're
World War
talking about after the war. You mentioned you sort of led up to World War II when you served, and after the war, it was sort of a boom time in the Catskills. Whether it was the Concord sort of developing into a larger kind of hotel or Grossingers, or all the smaller places. I don't think they winterized yet, but they all were prominent and grew during the certainly late 40s and through the 50s. and some would argue through the mid-60s was sort of the heyday of the Catskills, which is what we talk about here. Did your businesses thrive during that period of time and grow? Or did things change in some way when you were dealing with much larger entities than with, doing business across the table where you shake a hand is one thing. When you deal with a much larger enterprise.
I'll tell you, some of the biggest deals in Sullivan County hotel history were made outside my father's barn. They'd sit, they'd talk, they'd shake hands. They didn't need lawyers. Their word was good enough. And really, even though many of them ended up going broke, it's not because they wanted to do you out of their money. They just didn't have it, and conditions were bad. But I saw it when we were kids. My father, my mother, they'd stand outside in the driveway, and they shake hands with a hotel keeper.
But also, as these buildings, as these hotels grew bigger, they required more and more financing, and we just couldn't do it on a handshake anymore. Banks would never lend them what they really needed to do their expansion. The banks would usually, if they had to spend, say, $150,000 to build a 29-room addition, which was a typical addition for some reason.
The reason was the state had a law that over 30 rooms, you had to have a certain
fire protection and all that.
Fire escape. So therefore, the hotels were building 29 rooms at a time.
Fascinating.
Well, anyway, so then, what would usually happen when these hotels started to go with these larger and larger additions, nightclubs, new dining rooms, new lobbies, and swimming pools, where hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars was required, which the banks would normally lend them maybe a third of what was required. The various vendors, like the building contractors, the plumbing and heating people, the lumber dealers, painters, they would all team together to take secondary financing below the banks. And that's how that was known as Sullivan County currency. And where they would give us a second mortgage, which might have been worth something, and they would give us promissory notes. And of course, we all had to pray that they had a good summer. Sometimes they had decent summers, and sometimes they didn't. And we knew if they didn't have a good summer, we couldn't get paid because they didn't have it to pay us. But eventually, there was a period when hotels were doing very well in this area, until they couldn't compete with the bigger expansions that was going on, like with Concord, Grossingers, and you had the Pines and the Neville. The small people simply couldn't afford to supply the entertainment, the swimming pools, the ice skating rinks.
Wasn't one of the issues winterizing? Most of the
And
hotels were only geared for summer without heat in each unit, and the larger hotels had the heating. And so to convert a resort to a winter capable resort was a major undertaking in those 29 rooms that didn't have heat in the first place.
Exactly. And when these small hotels tried to build indoor swimming pools in order to stay open for the winter, and these other amenities, they just got too far into debt, and they really had to fold, because a lot of these people, who owned these hotels, didn't just didn't just own the hotel. They had to go back to Manhattan to work in the various industries. Some were taxi drivers, some were clothing salesmen, some worked in the garment industry and other things. And people looked upon them as very wealthy, glamorous people, but they were very hard-working people who owned all these resorts, who their wives usually very often worked in the kitchen or worked as in the offices, and the husbands would be outside taking care of the grounds and other things. It was very tough.
Yeah, but they got the
That
chance.
looked glamorous.
Yeah, but they got the chance to stand on the stage Saturday night and introduce the the next act.
Right.
Yes.
They were almost all family businesses.
Yes.
Correct. Which
And-
meant that your aunts, your uncles, your cousins,
And
as one
children,
grew up
they
in the
all
business,
worked.
everybody showed up to work in the dining room or in the day camp or a busboy, a bellhop, or what have you. And there was good earnings for everybody for those at least 10 weeks
By that standard.
by that standard and in those days. So, so there was a time when it was building up to good businesses. After the war, the late 40s, 50s, and into the early 60s, everything was on the rise. Everything was adding construction and so
Except that airplanes came along and cheap flights to islands. And therefore, I used to listen to people, they'd always, oh, all you're doing the hotels is they eat all these big meals. That was true. But on the other hand, when they went on ship, I talked to some of the people when when they came back from their shipping. You should see the food. They all talked about the food. It was wrong to talk about the hotel that served you all the food, but when you went for a cruise, you talked about the food a great deal.
Well, I can also remember there was a friend of mine who became a neurosurgeon in Middletown. And he used to work at the Stevensville Hotel. He used to work at the Stevensville Hotel in Swan Lake. And he became a successful neurosurgeon. And they built a golf course, and the son-in-law invited me and the architect by the name of Dennis Giroux and this neurosurgeon and for lunch. While he was going to college, he worked at the Stevensville first as a busboy and then as a waiter. And he was sort of proud that he made a success and the owner of the hotel, Harry Dinnerstein, came around to greet us and ask how things were. And I remember this neurosurgeon saying, I don't know if you remember me, but I worked in this hotel and I worked my way through college by working here, and now I'm a neurosurgeon. And the owner said, how am I supposed to remember you? You know how many neurosurgeons I put through school here? But it's nice to see you. So he said, I put many doctors and lawyers and engineers through school here by working here, waiting on tables.
Right. Once things began to go sort of downhill in terms of the hotel industry, how did your lives change? Was that a factor in selling the business, the gas business, propane business?
No.
What happened when the hotels began to... You mentioned earlier that people couldn't make it. My impressions are that it was fairly stable through whether the 30s, except for the war years, that hotels didn't go bankrupt, as it were, and someone else came in. Most of the time they stayed in the family. Things changed in the early 60s when they literally began to close, and they were not reopened by anyone else, although some were.
Was it the 60s or was it later?
It began
70s,
in the
maybe?
late 60s
You
and
know,
into
but
the 70s.
It seems to me that the banks were responsible. I remember who the heck was the president of the bank in Liberty. I know him well, but he was a friend of mine. But I sat there one day, and Irv Brazell was an accountant, and he came to me one day. We should both help out some hotel keeper, the small one, out near Livingston Manor. Well, before you got there, but further in.
Parksville.
And he wasn't even a customer of ours then. He wasn't even. I said, Irv, why should I sign a note? He's not even. He doesn't even buy gas from us. But my brother Mars had started doing plumbing work some plumbing up there on his own, anyway. And I said to Irv. So I said to Irv Brazell, I said, all right, he needs $5,000. So I said, all right. So he went into the Woodbridge Bank, and Ben Twilliger was the president at the time, and we endorsed a note for him for $5,000, which he paid back the next summer. I mean, he paid him, and then he did business with. He started doing business with me. You know, that wasn't a condition, but he did it. He was a nice fellow, and And so I went to see the bank president in Liberty one day. I said, you turned them down. Well, what they did, and they had the first mortgage, was maybe $150,000, which was nothing, nowhere near what the hotel was worth. Although you couldn't sell it.
I was going to ask.
You couldn't sell it. But anyway, so I said to the bank president, I said, you think you're being smart, you're really protecting the bank. But you're not protecting the bank because they can't get by on the little. If you give them, and if they give out notes to the butcher and the gas man and the plumber and so on, I said, they can't meet all these obligations. So they have, eventually there's a year's worth of business that goes by. I said, what, but why don't, but if you gave them a proper mortgage, let's say a 10-year mortgage with $300,000, they'd be able to pay their bills, and we'd survive and they'd survive. But you're going to see, but what you're doing, you think you're being smart. And he was a friend of mine. I said, but you think you're being smart, but you're not. We're going to lose our money, and you're going to lose your money too. And that's exactly what happened later on, because the banks didn't want to get involved with buying in a hotel.
And basically, talking for my business, being working as a plumbing contractor, as I got older, I started taking over my father's plumbing business. I saw that there was problems down the road, and I knew I had to do something different, besides depending for my livelihood on the hotel and bungalow business to do plumbing and heating work. And that's where I started getting into public work, schools and shopping centers out of the area. And I started doing work in various prisons. I had to learn how to do public work. But I was very fortunate. Because, a lot of life has to do with good fortune and being in the right place. My first job that I took in the public arena was at the Livingston Manor School. And I got the plans. I studied it the best I could, but I really didn't know what I was doing. And I put in a bid to do the job. And I got the job. I was maybe $25,000 cheaper than the next lowest bidder. And the architects were a group from Roscoe, New York, Benedict and Hammerstrom. They were the architects of the school, and they saw I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know what a shop drawing was. I didn't know what a lot of the technical terms were. For some reason, they took a liking to me. And they explained what I had to do and showed where I can buy materials. They gave me names of companies, and they put in a good word for me because they wouldn't sell, these big companies wouldn't sell to some unknown plumber. They wanted to get paid also. And basically, that's how I started dealing with some of these bigger construction jobs, working for the state. And that's saved me financially from maybe disappearing, but I did well.
One of the questions that we like to ask is the impact of the Borscht Belt or the Catskill culture on the country, on the community at large. You mentioned the hotel owner who said that he had helped put many young men, mostly men, but some women, through various education programs and professionals. What would you say the impact of the Catskills resort nature was on the country? What is it that stands out about it's basically history now, it's gone, or it's changed so much. What would you say if someone asked about the importance of the Catskills?
The Jewish culture with the Jewish comedy at that time is now something that the country, all your great comedians who got their start in the Catskills, making fun of the Jewish people. There's no group of people that I know of that makes more fun of themselves than the Jewish people do. We have a way of laughing at ourselves very, very often. And I think this culture permeated throughout the country, because when I go to Florida now, and I meet people my age, and they also miss the culture and the camaraderie they had when they came up to the Catskills. You can't find that anywhere else in the country. It's gone. I mean, as the Jewish people who came here got more successful, and more accepted in other areas, they kind of left the Catskills to go to other areas where they were previously not accepted, and I think that helped bring about the downfall of the Catskills, the acceptance of Jews in other areas. I could be wrong, but that was my impression.
A great deal of what Raymond says, I think, is accurate. But also, as vacations became cheaper elsewhere, or competitive with this area here, the Jewish people, as they succeeded, as they would lawyers and doctors and school teachers and so forth, they could now feel that they could travel around, and they were, as Raymond said, they were accepted in other areas. So therefore, they stopped going to the Borscht Belt. I remember one time I was speaking to some lending people. They were men who were in the lending business in Florida. And I said to them, they said to me one day, where you're from, that usual thing, where you're from, and so on. And I said to them, why don't you ever come back? They said the happiest days of their lives were the holiday they spent in Sullivan County. They were maybe 60 then, rather successful. So I said to them, well, why don't you come back? They said, well, we don't want to come back. I said, you'd be surprised how they've changed, and you could come there. But they loved it, the happiest days of their lives, but they vacationed elsewhere. It wasn't fashionable to come to Sullivan County.
Let's look forward a little bit. We have a couple of minutes left. The Concord, which was one of the most prominent hotels, has now been designated as an area for gambling resort, which is now going to become a destination. It's already under construction as we speak. Do you think that will help resuscitate, if you will, or resurrect or rejuvenate the Catskills as we know it as a vacation destination?
I think it will help. It's never going to be what it was, but I think it will help to make a resort stop, because it'll become fashionable for those people who are gambling. So, okay, where'd you go? Well, you know where the casino is. So I think it's going to have a positive impact, but not. It will never be the way it was when it was a Jewish resort primarily.
I agree with what Harold said, and the Catskills can never come back to the glamorous place it was, because it's now being more or less taken over by the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jewish people, who really, because of their religious beliefs, do not eat in non-kosher restaurants, and they have their own way of living. And I don't think you're going to see this type of resort operation ever coming back. However, luckily we have these people that moved up there, the ultra-Orthodox Jewish people, who basically, without them, we would have nothing but deserted areas all over the county, especially in the town of Fallsburg and probably in the town of Thompson. So in many ways, they sometimes act different than us, but I'm getting to know a lot of them, and they're very charming, very friendly people. But because they have to live a certain way, I don't think that you're ever going to see the nightclubs and the restaurants and the bars and the grills that flourished during its heyday ever come back again.
Proudest memory of growing up in the Catskills? If people ask you what's the thing you're most proud of, or that sticks in your mind, or a highlight of each of you quickly with the few minutes that we have left.
I say one of the greatest things, the fact is that as we went through high school, and I personally never saw all this anti-religion, we all got along very well. My best friends, When I was going to college during the war years, before I went to the Army, 6 of the fellows, 4 of them were not Jewish, came down, took rooms across the street from the University of Pennsylvania so we could be together. And one by one, they left for the Army, as we were called up. But they didn't say, well, he's Jewish, he's not. They were our friends. And I think that still remained true to a great extent today.
The close-knit nature of the community.
Yes.
Well, what I remember is the glamour, being able to see the shows, meeting girls and boys who came up in the summertime, and it was a very, I considered it very glamorous. It was a way to socialize, and I met many new people in the summertime, and it was exciting. I don't think, I'm very fortunate that I grew up here. I still look back at something that I don't think anyone will ever be able to experience, the fun. I mean, you drive along the road, there are always people hitchhiking. You had no hesitation to pick them up and drop them off wherever they were going. It was something that I think wouldn't be wise to do today. But it was that type of life.
Very good. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Harold Gold and Raymond Gold of South Fallsburg, reminiscing about growing up in the Borscht Belt, as we call it, or the Catskills culture, and sharing some of their stories and some of their history, some of their family's involvement over a period of many decades. Thank you very much for your contribution to our project.
And thank you for having us.